Good.
Front row dads, welcome back. If you're new to the show, I'm your host, John Vroman. This is the show for family men with businesses, not businessmen with families. And today we're going to be talking with Daniel Matalon, and we're going to be talking about agreements, sameness before differences, and ultimately, how might we all find enough within ourselves and enough with the resources that surround us. When I heard Daniel on one of our members, Matt Drinkon, he has a show, The Eternal Optimist, and I listened to that interview and I just thought to myself, what Daniel is talking about is probably why I get into so many fights with my wife and kids. And this conversation, for me, selfishly, is about learning to ease my nervous system and maybe create more collaborative and harmonic conversations in my home, something I'm constantly working on. But I'm pretty fiery. My wife is pretty fiery. Our kids are pretty spicy, and so the energy can be elevated. Gentlemen, before we dive into this interview, I just want to mention two things. One, we have a summit coming up in November, online, 3 hours, deep dive. You can join from anywhere in the world. Our summit that we just had was 100 men from a variety of different countries around the world, focused on business evolution. And every 2 months, we take a dive into one of our pillars, from parenting to marriage, all the way to wealth and legacy, emotional intelligence, etc. And November is going to be emotional intelligence. We're going to be talking about, and I didn't plan this, but the nervous system, which if it's dysregulated, you're going to be very sensitive and freak out and get triggered very quickly and raise your voice and yell. So if you want to learn how to be cool, calm, collected with your family and your business and your communities, this is going to be a summit you're going to want to attend. And also December 2nd through the 4th, we've got our first live event open to the public. We've done events for 7 years that have all been private only for members, but now we are open it up. So members are coming, people who are thinking about members are coming. So be there with us. It's going to be amazing. Check out the lineup of speakers and what we're going to be doing there at frontrowdads.com/live. Daniel, welcome to the show. So glad to have you, man. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
So glad to know that you and I have an opportunity to discuss arenas of our conversation, John, that don't often come up in other podcasts.
Yes, yes.
You know, you asked me before we got on the episode am I a dad? I have 2 kids. I have a goddaughter, and I have a couple of kids that I'm somewhat parenting here and there, of a single mom that I'm involved with. And there's a child within that family that's a little bit on the outside of everybody else. He's quite aggressive and a little bit difficult to deal with. And sometimes we end up, ostracizing kids like that even more so than they already ostracized themselves. And there's this one set of conversations that this child overheard me on, and talking about the kind of things that you and I are about to talk about. And he got really intrigued by the whole understanding of agreement, and started to shift his behavior and results. And he then had an episode where he did something quite violent and got punished rightly for it. And I took him aside later and I said, "You really like this conversation of agreement, right?" He said, "Yeah." I said, what's the opposite of agreement? And he said, disagreement. And I had never thought of it before until I said it to him right at that moment. I said, no, agreement and disagreement dance with each other. I said, the opposite of agreement is war. And it became a foundation for a whole bunch of material that came out of that, and I think of the spiciness that you refer to, which exists in my family relationships as well. And, a relationship has a nervous system too, not just a human being. A family has a nervous system also. We all have a desire to be right. It's part of what drives our identity. It's the reason, I think, why we have fake news problem, by the way, but that's a topic for another day. But I think it's really important for us to have compassion with the conversation of disagreement in a certain kind of way that can bend towards finding agreement, as opposed to bending towards polarization.
That is something I want to get into, and I want to put a little context out there for everybody listening. So when you read Daniel's bio, which we'll put at frontrowdads.com, you'll see things like social impact producer, investor, climate reality leader, founder. By the way, I'm not laughing at those things, by the way. I'm more so laughing at, internally, I'm going, how the fuck does Daniel get it all done? how does he do all this? Founder of, the Is There Enough movement, the global campaign of financial inclusion, social justice. It just goes on, right? You're traveling. And when I was listening to you on Matt's show, I'm like, Daniel's got a lot to say on a lot of different things. And I kept wondering, where do we begin? So here's the thing. If you had to put it in one sentence, Daniel, which I know you can't sum up your life, your bio, your mission, your wants, needs, desires for the world in one sentence. But if you had to narrow it down to one sentence of what is taking your absolute focus right now, your primary lead domino to your mission, what is it?
It's to play the world game, which I'll define in a moment what that is, which involves selling people on the world game. That it is an actual concept and something that's accessible and something we can all participate in both small and grand ways. But the way in which we can win the world game, which is to make the world work for 100% of humanity, that's Buckminster Fuller's definition, with a few other conditions he added to it as well. But how can we make the world work for 100% of humanity? That is my one driving force. If bobbing for apples would do it, I would do that. It just turns out that asking the question of what enough is happens to be the fastest pathway to achieving the world game.
Okay, so let's unpack this a little bit. So let's go back and define the world game again, and maybe just take us through a little bit of a journey of, who is Buckminster Fuller? How did this come on your radar? What is the world game? Why is it important?
So it came on my radar through business. So your audience will appreciate that. Back in the day, we called it social entrepreneurship. Now we call it social impact. But my teachers were students of Buckminster Fuller, including Robert Kiyosaki, which I'm sure a lot of your audience will know, Rich Dad, Poor Dad series. He was my direct trainer of a seminar program still in existence today called Money and You, moneyandyou.com for people who want to look that up. And they actually have an event of their own in November, which is rarely done in the United States. And what Buckminster Fuller basically espoused was, and he's the man who we would know from the geodesic dome, right? He had 50 predictions for the year 2000, 49 of those 50 came true. We came very close on the 50th. And he proposed, and remember, he did this without an internet, and he was a mathematician, a research scientist. He brought incredibly broad array of statistics to prove this was possible theoretically, that we had enough resources to support many more people on the planet than we presently have even now, even in his time. But simply that we had 150 admirals steering Spaceship Earth. He's known for that term, Spaceship Earth, as well, that we're all going in different directions. That humanity had to come to a recognition that because of those different directions, we end up in war. And before we have war games. And before we have a world that works, we need a world that works game. And the way he would play the game is he would take a gym map, on the gym floor, pardon me, and he would show the distribution of population and resources and stimulate conversation of the real conversation of why we ask, is there enough? Which is obviously conditional and situational, and you're never going to answer that in a fully direct way, yes or no. But at the end of the day, basically, when we ask, is there enough, we're getting to the question of what are we going to do about it? And what are we going to do about it? The it in that sentence is whatever we think that there's not enough of. That's not water, even though water scarcity causes most of the wars on planet Earth. We have plenty of water, even from the sky. I can tell you as a social impact investor that looks at technology to help heal the world, so to speak, for about $1 trillion, we could get clean drinking water powered by the sun and only drawn from the atmosphere, never have to touch the groundwater again. So we have like a perfectly good solution, but we do not have the mobilization of opinion and dollars to actually affect real solutions that we know take place if we have what? Our friend, agreement. And what really is very difficult for us to do in your family, in my family, and in the family of man, it's very difficult for us to exercise agreement because we come from 70,000 years of war. We are traumatized by war. We carry it in our DNA. DNA carries visual information, we believe now. And so the idea that we would wake up in the 21st century and suddenly be non-warriors without paying attention to this very important problem is really threatening our existence more than climate change. So our proposition is that if we can figure out a way, and you're doing that in your work in your way, if we can figure out how to affect collaboration, let's call it, I call it agreement, right? because agreement is the measure of collaboration, not just convening people together and being aligned, but actually doing something. But whatever way we do it, if we can affect collaboration agreement, not necessarily from a place of love and compassion, which I wish we had for each other, but even from a place of what's good for my individual interests. It's a lot better to live in a world where I don't have to fight and pick up a gun or find other forms of warfare, to actually tolerate my neighbor so we can both coexist and actually grow the existence of human life on this planet.
So Daniel, there's a number of places I want to take the conversation, but let me bring it back to a very practical application of this, right? So Tatiana and I recently, Tatiana's my wife, and we've been married together for 16 years, married for about 14, together 16. At this moment, literally weeks ago, we realized that one of our points of contention is that we go to these parties, friends gatherings, etc., and she believes that parties are for socialization. We go to a party and she just wants to talk to everybody. And I was going into these parties thinking, I haven't seen her a lot this week, right? I want to connect with her. We had a fundamental different, intention, if you will. We didn't have an agreement of how we were going to show up. And I think that a lot of times, if I look at challenges I have with my kids, as another example, with screen time, it's the agreement isn't clear. When I think about their contributions or chores or whatever you would call them to the house, my son wakes up in the morning and he's responsible for the dishwasher and the trash and filling our water tank and so on. And we would find out that he would wait till the very, very end. And then we would be asking him, are you going to do it? Are you going to do it? So we're harassing him to do it because we're worried that he won't. We're trying to hold him accountable, but we don't have a clear agreement. Should this be done by 7 a.m.? If it's not done by 7, then we can check in with you. But so many of the struggles, the pains that I'm experiencing, I can clearly go back and see that the root of that is lack of agreement, right? And so if that were the case for other people, which I'm just going to project and imagine that a lot of people are nodding their head going, yeah, I have some version of that or that exact version in my house. How do we look at this? How do we reverse engineer, or what is the framework for collaboration, connection, and something I've heard you say, sameness before difference? Talk us through the solution here as well.
I'm really glad you bring this to this practical aspect, because there's no doubt that when I started this and you asked me what drove my passion, it was really to look at the world and humanity as a whole. I was very surprised as I traveled around the world that the response to "is there enough" was most often, am I enough?
Yeah, totally.
And how do I make my world work for 100% of my world? Never mind how to make the world work. That's way out of my league kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah, it feels big.
It does. And, so to bring it to this practical aspect, you and I are pursuing this question. Those of us listening to our voices are also pursuing this question. How do I make this work at home? Because we value the result of agreement. The only way that you can get other people to participate in seeking a result of agreement is to find a way for them to value it in their own personal interest. I'm an advisor to blockchain companies. Blockchain companies have learned in their tokenomics, which is the word for economics for a token environment. Tokenomics is like designing a government, basically. We're going to tax this, incentivize this, and so on. And one of the truisms that has come out of that world is that you can't just make it work for the whole community. It's got to work for the individual, or it's not going to fly anywhere. So if you're asking your son to value agreement itself, this is not agreements we're talking about. And by the way, Grammarly changes my writing so much over this word agreement versus agreements. I can't use Grammarly. It's like I'm inventing new language basically on this. And I shouldn't say it's a whole bunch of people besides me, to be fair and give just due to where it's due. But in order for us to raise agreement to a value rather than a transaction alone, we have to basically sell people that agreement is much more in your interests in the long run than having a bunch of conflict with me all day long. If we don't have that agreement itself is an agreement, it's pretty hard to go anywhere else.
All right. How do we do that? Let's just pause right there for a second. How do we do that?
What I've done with the little kids that are around me that I've had successfully had this conversation, and seriously, yesterday, I saw two of them bickering and stopped bickering going, what's our agreement here? I swear to God, it actually works. And basically, it's about the subject of trust. Children want to be trusted. They want to be empowered too, right? The reason why kids love money is not because they love money, and I've never met a kid who doesn't love money ever. Right? It's because it represents the ability to get things done, which is the true definition of power. Power is not some men in a cabal sitting in a corner figuring out how to enslave us. Power is actually just the simple ability to get things done. And our power increases where there is trust. And how do you build trust where there isn't? Is by agreement. Usually by small ones, by the way, not the big ones, right? The big ones are too inaccessible, right? Just even when we've been drawn into a lot of political conversations, as you would imagine from me talking about this. And if I take an American who loves Trump, an American who hates Trump, and I bring them into a room, and I've done social research on this, and I require them to acknowledge that they're both Americans and then go argue, and then do the same test with people who don't start out that way, we get a completely different outcome. Right? So how do I sell a kid who's defying me at a certain moment where, you know, there's an authority issue there, is I bargain with him the way a good negotiator does. And I say, you want to have trust with me on an ongoing basis, right? So right now you're faced with a choice. It gives them the choice rather than telling them what to do. Do you want to continue to lie to me? Because it's pretty obvious you're lying about this or that. Or do you want to build trust with me long-term? Your choice. And if they make the wrong choice, I'll still support that they exercise their choice, and I can acknowledge the choice, but I can also let them know that there's a consequence of that choice too. Yep. So there's a mutual relationship, even though authority is still maintained. Once that's in place, once it's agreed to that trust is a good thing, that integrity is really in your self-interest, not just to live up to somebody else's expectation, which is usually how you hear about responsibility and integrity when you're a kid, right? Is do what you're told. That's your responsibility. Like, well, everybody's got their responsibility. Everybody's got to do their hard work, and you have to do it too. Is not quite as enticing as, do you want to go anywhere, be anywhere, do anything? Do you want to be valuable in life? Do you want your life to matter? Like, I don't know a 5-year-old that doesn't want to answer those questions, because I've tested that too. And if that's what you want, you've got 2 simple roads to go, the way most people go, which is engaging in a lot of conflict, and every once in a while they have an agreement, or devoting your life to agreement.
Interestingly, Tiger, my 13-year-old, and I are listening to the 4 agreements right now on the way to school every day. And like the first of the agreements is be impeccable with your word. And this morning, the whole lesson was about what does it mean to be impeccable, right? And the timing of this conversation couldn't be any more perfect. In fact, literally 45 minutes ago in the kitchen, my wife and I are talking about, like, why is there a rub here in this particular area of our life? Why is there struggle? Why is there conflict? We agree on so many things. We align on so many important elements of life we agree on. Like, I could just start rattling them off that could easily be disagreed upon. Like even stuff like health, how we feed our kids, like we totally align. We could not be aligned on that. And that could cause a major challenge, right? We align on travel and adventure and so many things, right? People, we like the same people for the most part. There's so many things, but she looked at me and she goes, in some areas, we don't trust each other, right? We don't, there's a thing that we're like, well, I don't know if I'd totally trust you in this area. That was literally 45 minutes ago. All this is like the universe keeps sending me this message of, John, we need to talk about trust. We need to talk about agreements. We need to talk about boundaries. We need to talk about safety. We need to talk about, like, and by the way, that word safety is like the word of my year. I never would have, like, my personal brand to myself is not one that deals with safety. Really, I think about my life. I have an identity of somebody who's like a risk taker in business, jumping out of airplanes, doing whatever it might be. It was always about like assuming a certain amount of risk. what I've realized in 2022 is that as a 47-year-old with a 13-year-old and almost 8-year-old married for, again, a decade and a half, I'm looking at it going, safety is far more important to me than I've ever given it credit for. How does safety, in your opinion, Daniel, tie into all these things we're talking about? Trust, agreements, the foundational element of what we're ultimately trying to get to play the world game.
I don't think it's possible to have war if the world is safe enough.
Yeah.
In fact, when you take the question, our signature question, is there enough, and apply it, which is deliberately ambiguous, kind of a Rorschach test for everybody who answers it, because the way you answer it and everybody else answers is unique as a fingerprint. It's deliberately ambiguous for very, advantageous effect in neuroscience that you and your wife are practicing by even asking the question of what's going on here, which is indicative of a couple with some irreconcilable differences, but the way that they approach them is from curiosity. It sounds from what you're describing, over judgment, something that the Gottman Institute of Relationship identified.
Oh, we're good at judgment, by the way. In all fairness, I want to make sure I'm being totally authentic
right?
here.
We couldn't live the world without judgment, right? There's certain interpretation necessary, right? So we have to be compassionate. But in terms of taking the words, is there enough, and applying it to safety, is there enough safety? I would say not. How do we manufacture safety? And we actually do this with the Is There Enough conversation, by the way, on Clubhouse particularly. So those listening who want to listen to us on Clubhouse or are on Clubhouse and want to join our club and participate, I would invite you to join us, John, for that roundtable and have this conversation of what does it take to produce more safety? It's so inbred within our DNA as a business, the business side of what I do, which is Impact Launchpad. On impactlaunchpad.com, for any of your listeners that pull it up, we're actually saying that the reason we don't have enough money to invest in the future of humanity isn't because there's a lack of money, it's because there's a lack of safety for the money, right? So it's not just safety for human beings, it's also a lack of safety in our economic system. The idea that, we have a tussle between nationalism and globalism is all about a lack of safety. It's the real conversation that transcends both of those. So the thing I want to point out to everybody listening to us is that this asking of questions, and we use the question, is there enough? But if you look at Impact Launchpad, we actually ask, where will we find the $3.5 trillion necessary to invest in the future of humanity as defined by the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, which is, no matter if you're a negative person on the United Nations or a positive person on the United Nations, it's the greatest collaboration between private and public for social good that's ever existed on the planet thus far. And when we ask that question, we're really asking the world game question of, is there enough in the first place? And the question itself, not the words, is what really matters here. When you and your wife are approaching this from a questioning standpoint, you have a potential of identifying the places you agree, the places you don't, and using that foundation to be able to work out a workable solution that doesn't contravene each other's values. For example, back to the party situation, right? You like to use it as a time to spend with her. She likes to use it as a time to socialize with other people. Why should you both give up that value? Is there another possibility that you all go around and network together, for example, rather than apart? Is that workable? I don't know. But the posing of the question is so vital that when I discovered, like, is there enough was an accidental conversation. We were really pursuing Impact Launchpad over here, and out of some frustration, talking to prospective advancers and investors and people who could support the vision that we have, which I'll drop is a global impact investment bank for the world that's not owned by anybody. It's a big, big, big ambition. And when people, would hear about it, they would say, wow, what a great vision. Hope you can pull it off. To which I would say, well, I can if I get agreement. And when I asked this question, is there enough? It was an exasperation, like, isn't there enough for what I was proposing? And then there was such a strong response from the audience and other sorts of ripple things that I'll spare for sake of time. When I went to register the hashtag, is there enough? I discovered I couldn't put a question mark in a hashtag. Can't put it in a domain name. Can't put it in an email address, right? So our digital conversation, which is, we would agree, much more vitriolic than it is in real life, is perhaps we think linguistically, the paradigm that goes on in conversation online is all about everybody shoving facts at each other. And if you don't have the same opinion that I do, it's because you didn't see my facts and you're watching fake news. What we have to do in order to create collaboration, talking about sameness before difference, is even just ask each other, like, you believe that the Holocaust never happened? How could you tell me how you came to that conclusion? Where did you first come to that? What was the first time you ever heard that sentence? Because it's obvious, I would think, to most people listening to my voice that that obviously happened. And we could have different interpretations. Who's responsible? Who did this? What started this? I mean, that's all about historiography and all of that stuff. But there's some stuff that would seem to be so simple, and yet is not, because truth, and if you ask, is there enough safety? The first question is there enough truth? And truth is not just facts that we agree are true, but also beliefs that we believe are true, right? And these are massive, heady conversations on one hand, but at the same time, when you're talking to a child about integrity and trust, does truth matter in that quotient? Once they understand truth, and once they understand trust and integrity and responsibility and all those things, you can begin to show that truth is the currency of that, which is, why Don Miguel starts with that as the first core agreements. And we're somewhat connected by third parties. We're about to have a conversation, him and I, by the way.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah, that would be interesting to listen in on. Tell me about how you go back to the micro level of at home, right? Yeah. I like that idea of starting there, because I also like that old parable of, like, the guy who wanted to change the world, but he couldn't. So he went and tried to change the country, and he couldn't. So he tried to change his state, and all the way back to, well, he needed to change himself, which then he could influence his family and his neighbors and so on. How do you go about creating a culture in your house around these elements? I'm thinking about safety, thinking about dinner time tonight, thinking about conversations I might bring up to my family, like, hey guys, what makes you feel most safe in our home? Are there times, are there moments when you feel most safe? What does that help articulate that for me? Also, what is it? What do we agree on as a family? Guys, what do you think we all agree on collectively, the four of us, if it's just the four of us sitting around the table? Those types of questions, I think, are culture creating questions. And it's just like a family who's identified, like, what are their core values as a family? What do we care about? What do we agree on? What might we naturally do throughout the course of a day without too much effort? Not necessarily aspirational values, but where are we in the moment? All of this goes back to culture for me. So I'm curious for you, with the little ones at your house, what are you doing to have these conversations, to demonstrate them? And I also recognize, let me say for context, there are men listening to this with grown kids, young kids, and the conversation will vary based on age and stage, of course. But your thoughts, Daniel?
The name of the book that I'm releasing in 23 is called The First Agreement. It's not the four agreements, which you can understand why people would want to.
People want to connect you, yeah.
Yeah. And the first agreement is with yourself. That's where it starts. Transformation does not come from just raising your consciousness alone, needs that, but it really happens from demonstration. And we never like to hear that. We always want to tell other people what to do. And even when it's the thing we're struggling with, instead of owning that, usually the thing we're talking about is we're wanting to talk about it because we're trying to complete it within ourselves. And so it does start with yourself, that you yourself are committed to trust and integrity, even when it's inconvenient, because nobody cares about trust and integrity when it's convenient, right? And then second thing is what you've proposed, which is sitting down and asking rather than telling. Believe me, for 30 years, I was telling people that there was enough, because I was introduced to Buckminster Fuller 30 years ago. And I had this huge insight about the fact that the world could work for 100% of humanity if I could just go out and persuade people that that was true. Once I started asking people if there was enough, not going to say that everybody went, oh yeah, there's enough, because it had this whole ripple effect. But even people who could come to the end of that conversation, there really isn't enough to go around, and it really is us and them, which there are those people. they would walk out of the conversation with a little more respect for human life than when they walked into the conversation, to the point that I don't know if it can work for 100%, but let's try to make it work for as many as possible, especially starting with my tribe. Okay, I can accept that. That's an incremental ripple in the right direction. And I think merely willing to ask the question, shut up, and listen to what they have to say, and validate the values they express, even if they're wrong in your view about some facts or who did what and this and this, and it started that, because all of our arguments are about history. Our opportunities are the future. And we like to say that, and this is the first chapter of my book, The First Agreement. There's some little audios on thefirstagreement.com that describe each chapter. But the first chapter is about identity. And we say that identity is both my history and my choices. And my first agreement is in between the two, right? So I think what you've posed there is start asking more questions, close your mouth, and listen.
All right, let me read something to you, Daniel. I want to get your take on this. So, a little context for this poem, I suppose. And you probably know the author, how to say his name. Is it Kahlil Gibran?
I actually am not clear on the last name spelling, but it's okay. Kahlil, and I think some people colloquially call it Gibran, but it might be Gibran in the original.
It's called On Children. Have you heard this before?
I have, and please read it.
Yeah, so I want to get your take on this, because a lot of this has to do with being curious and with our children. It says, your children are not your children. They are sons and daughters of life's longing for itself. They come through you, but not from you. And though they are with you, they belong not to you. You may give them your love, but not your thoughts, for they have their own thoughts. You may house their bodies, but not their souls, for their souls dwell in the house of tomorrow, which you cannot visit, not even in your dreams. You may strive to be like them, but seek not to make them like you. For life goes not backward, nor tarries with yesterday. You are the boughs from which your children are you are the boughs from which your children as living arrows are sent forth. The archer sees the mark upon the path of the infinite, and he bends you with his might, that his arrows may go swift and far. Let your bending in the archer's hand be for gladness. For even as he loves the arrow that flies, so he loves also the bow that is stable. I'm curious that when you hear this, right? And we talk about impact, we talk about making a difference, we talk about bringing these ideas to our family. We want to bring this concept. And what I'm ultimately trying to bridge here, and I'm taking a lot of words to say it, but I'm trying to say it in as few words as possible, is as an influencer, as somebody who wants to make a difference in the world, bring this world game in, right? You're trying to influence people's thoughts, perhaps. And I'm not telling you what you're doing. It seems to me that's what we do. We're like, we believe in this. We believe in this idea. We're going to bring it to the world. We want to imprint this because we think it's right. Right? These concepts, these ideas, these words, these, like, again, Don Miguel and the Four Agreements, these words are magic. We create with them, we build with them, we can destroy with them. And yet in some cases, it's about surrender. You know, it's about the surrender experiment and letting go and being unattached and being curious and just asking the question and, right? Like, I am in conflict often with how much am I influencing and impacting and, right, and putting my blueprint onto somebody versus really trying to remain open to the dialogue and allow them to be, like, my children to be themselves without my influence, right? That they are my teacher as much as I might be theirs, or am I their teacher really, or are they just here to teach me?
Boy, your kids are lucky. That's what I want to say. If they don't think so, have them talk to me. So I hope I won't get too emotional on this to tell you that I've always wished to have young fathers hear what I have to say about the following, because Jim Rohn used to say it's a pity failures don't give seminars. They have so much to teach us, but no one would show up. And I give myself at most a C grade as a father. That's just my history. So I've been said, we're our history and our choices, and I'm making better choices today than I made as a father. And I've had this conversation with one of my kids at great length and another one in passing. And I think our role as a father, and I think our role as a teacher, and our role as a coach, and our role as an inspirer, or whatever we aim to be of some benefit to other people, is to help them become who they are, not who we think they should be. It's very challenging to really embrace that fully. It requires an incredible amount of humility. You will definitely encounter things with your student or your kid or whoever it is that you're having the opportunity to be in the presence to potentially influence, to inspire them to choose who they are. When I say we are our history and our choices, right? A lot of things we do with our kids are in reaction of what our parents did badly with us. We want to make sure that never happens to them. And we can do that in a functional way and a dysfunctional way, as I'm sure you know. And so when we talk about this history and choices thing, ultimately we want to put human beings into the place where they're able to exercise free choice in a responsible manner. Not an easy thing to do, even though it's easy to put into words. And I think that the expression I feel from listening to that poem, which you gave me some fresh expression on in my heart, is that just like possessions, they're not ours. We're just renting them while we're on this planet. And when it comes to human beings, each one of them has a unique perspective that no one else has. It's lonely in that perspective for all of us too. We all think nobody gets us, and we finally get a mate that does. We think that's a miracle. This is about the sameness before difference conversation also, because we just automatically start with our difference from each other, and maybe we find some sameness rather than doing it the other way. But to the question you're asking about our role as parents, I think that's the highest thing that we could do as an aspiration, is that if we were good at our job, we help them become who they were supposed to be.
I think this concept is just worth taking a beat, taking a breath, giving it a little space for somebody to just sit with that for a minute. Like I'm sitting with that for a minute. It's probably the thing I wrestle with the most is how much am I coaching, and how much am I curious, and how much of this is my ego, directing things because I'm fearful that if I don't get my kid to do this, I'm going to be a bad dad.
Right.
I'll get judged.
Right.
He won't be successful. He won't be able to take care of himself. So much of it's driven by fear. That's what I've come to realize a lot. And that goes back to safety and all these things. You start to see the tapestry behind them all. I don't know how they all fit together perfectly. I don't think I ever will, but I'm starting to see the big pattern for myself, at least what makes sense to me.
Because you appear to me to have grasped, if it hasn't been put in words before, just as you just took a moment and took a beat, exhibited it, it's okay for us to have some ambiguity.
Yes.
We don't tolerate that very well. We want immediate answers. Like, well, what's that good? You're just talking, you're not actually doing anything. Well, if you want to do something new, you're going to need some talk. You want it to be the right kind of talk, I would agree, right? And we've done a lot of work on figuring out what sorts of talk tends towards getting things done, as opposed to being embroiled in our arguments over history, right? Which is what they are, even at a nation state level, but also in our families. And when you bring the tapestry of love and fear, which you basically just did, that there's really only two basic poles in the world between love and fear. Most of my greatest mistakes in life, including ones within my family, have come from wanting to not have something happen and do my actions towards what I don't want, as opposed to doing the more difficult task of figuring out what I do want and maybe even tolerating some ambiguity when I really don't know what the fuck I'm going to do.
Yeah.
And this is also a chapter in the book, is that we will struggle. If you're struggling with money, you're struggling with relationships, you're struggling with artistic pursuits, you listening to my voice, just think of the thing you struggle with the most. That's like a pattern that keeps happening again. You keep thinking you've evolved and gotten past it, and then it rears its ugly head in another way. I guarantee you that you are much clearer about what you don't want out of that pattern than what you do. And the longer you stay in the don't want category of avoiding fear, you can't connect to what actually will transcend it, right? This is why we think the word enough is a transcendence of the argument of scarcity and abundance. Scarcity and abundance is a false question. The question is what is enough? And by the way, when you ask someone else what enough is, and people will see this on our website, isthereenough.org, we have an agreement academy that's basically been created out of this silly little 3-word conversation. And the Agreement Academy, we give a certificate to people who go out and actually interview 10 other people about what they think is enough. And when they come back to us, we debrief it with them. And what we see is that the person who's the interviewer, not the interviewee, the interviewer becomes, we think of it as like a software upgrade in agreement making permanently out of just 10 hours of, and they're helping our social research. So it's a nice exchange, of course. But it really comes down to starting with what works, as you said earlier in this conversation that you and your wife do, right? Well, we've got this we agree on and this we agree on. You're not going right to the thing you disagree on. Like you guys are searching for a foundation that you can work from. It's kind of like the relationship version of gratitude. Right? So let's start with, like, I'm now waking up in the morning because I heard somebody on a podcast that made perfect sense to me. When I wake up in the morning, and I'm always thinking about all these moving parts that you mentioned at the beginning of this call and all the things that I'm involved in. And of course, my mind goes immediately to all the things that are broken, not working. This is it. And now I wake up in the morning, I heard on a podcast, I make myself smile for 15 seconds with like a fake smile, but it becomes real. And then I start thinking of the things that I am in agreement or, acknowledging with gratitude. And the first couple of days, it's not very normal, but after a while, it's just like starting with sameness before difference is not normal. You have to program it. But after 30 days or so, like anything else, it becomes a habit.
Daniel, there's a lot that we unpacked here. There's a lot of concepts and ideas and things to play with for the guys. There's a buffet, but what is, in your opinion, the one step that these men, that you would invite them to take on, to consider, if there was just one action, looking at all of what we talked about, what is it?
In answer to your question, we've created a game, an expression of that, a product to come out of Is There Enough, which I'll mention in a moment. But what that product represents is an individual commitment to make agreement over war. Now, some people listening to us may think that's a little too dramatic, right? Because they think of war as with a gun, right? But we have a lot of conflict. Everybody here is not only a dad, but a business person, right? Think about your greatest moments of triumph. You're saying, I'm killing it, right? Or we blew up, or like we've got so much language that equates business success with war. You are a product of 70,000 years of war. When I talk about history and choices, exercise the choice that wherever possible, and you have to defend yourself if you're attacked. Like, I don't consider Ukraine at war. I consider Ukraine defending itself. Okay, there's a difference, right? So I'm not talking about getting rid of guns or military or anything like that, but I am saying that aggression is a natural instinct, particularly when we have fear and feel threatened, right? Because then what is defense, right? But if I choose to exercise agreement over war as my ethic, and we do an each one, teach one, each one, teach one demonstration of that, you cannot have but positive ripples. And Buckminster Fuller used to say, the only way you really know your purpose, no matter what you think it is consciously, because your purpose outlives your consciousness, basically, if you look at it in the grand scheme of things, the only way you really know that you're in the right place at the right time doing the right thing is look at where the positive ripples are. And whatever you were doing while the positive ripples were happening, keep doing that. In my case, I didn't expect to discover this Is There Enough thing. I was focused on this Impact Launchpad thing. But the more I started doing Is There Enough, the more the Impact Launchpad thing kept rippling positive ripples around the world. So I keep doing this. So the commitment that we're inviting people to take, you could either say it's symbolic or real. We think it's real, is we're releasing a treaty based on this idea. And that will issue 100 million certificates to this treaty And we will engender those, we believe, by our strategy, which is well thought out in finance, to get 100 million people to make this commitment individually. It sort of looks like it's 100 million people all agreeing on one agreement, but it's actually 100 million individual agreements, which means if we failed and we only got 2 million of the 100 million, it's still going to have that ripple. And is there an up.org/treaty explains our reasoning and all this other stuff. But whether you actually went so far as to become part of that symbolic or real effort, the fact that you just begin to question, is it possible, even though I think I'm a peaceful guy, that I really do come from 70,000 years of war? And is it possible that my desire to be right is really about vanquishing my foe, as opposed to finding collaboration that we can both move forward with?
So many possible actions here to take, gentlemen, as you, before you go, don't hit stop on this recording yet. I've got ideas for you. So a couple things. One, we're going to put a lot of this at frontrodads.com, links to all of Daniel's stuff. So if you're going regularly to frontrodads.com, then follow the rabbit hole and enjoy exploring Daniel's work and his mission. We'll put all of it there. We will put the quote, the image that you could download, you could print, you could read it to your spouse, you could share it with your kids if you wanted to. The Kahlil quote we'll put on the site as well. There's some things here that I'm going to do. Now, I want to reflect back to you, Daniel, how you changed my life today. The one thing I'm going to do is right in front of me, right in front of my desk on the wall, or on the door, actually on the glass, there's a, I just put up this sticky, like Post-it, dry erase wallpaper that I could like write on every day. And I see things when I leave my office to go to my family. I'm going to write a couple questions there. I'm going to start gathering interesting questions, and I'm going to start bringing them to my family when I leave my office. I'm going to experiment for like the next 7 days, see how this goes, where every time I leave my office, I'll see these questions and I'll bring one of them into the family domain. Some of the questions I want to explore with my family at dinner or on the drive home from school with my 13-year-old that I do twice a day to and from school. What's enough? Interesting question. Where do you feel safe? I brought that up earlier. I have one of my best friends, John Kane, who always does the tell me what you know about blank, right? It's just that's how he starts conversations in the car. Tell me what you know about drugs. Tell me what you know about sex. Tell me what you know about safety, or tell me what you know about, right? This country, whatever, just everyday play with tell me what you know about, and really get to know your kids, because they might teach you some stuff, which is pretty cool. And of course, this depends on what age they are. Tell me your thoughts around our family agreements. What agreements do we have? I love the question of the internal question. Am I making agreements, or am I making am I in defense, or am I at war right now? Am I in search of an agreement? Or maybe I could just internally or externally explore, when there's a conflict, what agreement is unclear here? And is there a way, and I could see myself doing it with real sarcasm, so I need to not do that, but is there a way that I could help identify the agreement without seeming to be righteous, or egotistical in that way, but really curious around the agreement that currently exists or could exist that might help resolve the warlike tendencies that we get into here at the house. We get to very defensive. And one of my therapists years ago said, defensiveness is the first act of war. Defensiveness is the first act of war. And I thought that was very profound. So all of this is fascinating to me, Daniel. I love that. I love where we got to today. I love the spirit of this conversation around trust and safety and agreements and what's enough, what's not enough, sameness, right, but before difference. All of this, my whole body is a yes to right now, and it's meaningful work. It's meaningful work for all you men out there listening to. And my invitation is also not only process this on your own, but connect with other men around this subject, right? Get a dinner going with some guys, go for a walk, get a workout in, call somebody, set up a one-to-one, bring this question. If you're in our group and you're in a band, which is a small group in Front Row Dads, then bring it to your band meetings, bring it to our next online group Q&A call, bring it to the summit that we have coming up in November for the emotional intelligence, bring it to the live event in December, but pay attention, notice your wins, figure out what your asks are, and then bring that to other men so that you can be in conversation. Spark this dialogue from this point forward. That's my ask for everybody. Again, Daniel's work will be at frontrowdads.com. And Daniel, if there's one website we sent people to, a hub, where would it be?
Istthereenough.org. Istthereenough.org.
Got it.
And let me thank you for bringing the word clarity into this conversation, because we are fairly considered idealistic in our objectives. We don't think so. We think that we're about clarifying. And the question of, is there enough? Just asking a human being, do you think there's enough? Typically, the person will say, enough what? Like you haven't finished the conversation. And I say to them, well, you tell me, what do you think there's not enough of? That's really what our conversation is about, is clarifying what there's not enough of, so that we can begin to deliberate what can we do about it. And when we get to the what are we going to do about it, whether we say it out loud or not, we're either going to have conflict or agreement from our position. And the choice of agreement is elusive and difficult, but it is the path that suffocates war and conflict.
So good. Daniel, I wish I was looking right here. This, by the way, is our retreat manual, for our in-person VIP retreat. This is last year's. The one from the spring has a question, a page in there, and on one side it says what's enough, and the other one says what's not enough. It's just brilliant. Wow. Yeah, this was a huge conversation for us at our last event. I love your work. I knew that Matt was not steering me wrong with this introduction, so shout out to Matt Drinkon, host of the Eternal Optimist podcast. Wonderful human, incredible front row dad brother, and thank you to you, Daniel, for your work and your continued work in the world. It's important. We applaud you, and thank you so much for being here today. When you're in Austin, hit me up, man. Let's get together in person.
Thank you, John.